start with some good news, huh?
Yeah.
7 years ago, the New York Times ran a full-page ad that called the science of climate change irrefutable and called the consequences of climate change catastrophic and irreversible. Those were the words in the advertisement. Science, irrefutable, consequences, catastrophic, and irreversible. Among the signatories to that full-page advertisement was Donald Trump. Also, Don Trump, Eric Trump, and Ivanka Trump, and the Trump Organization. So, maybe there's a window. They have been there. Second, 3 Treasury Secretaries, Republican Treasury Secretaries, very distinguished individuals, have announced their plan for a price on carbon. That is a significant step, and it shows that once you get away from the artillery range of the fossil fuel industry that are actually out as a former official where they can't hurt you so much anymore, there's a lot of good sense happening in the Republican Party on this issue. Third, I see that good sense in the Senate. I can't tell you how many conversations I have with Republican colleagues who say, Sheldon, keep doing what you're doing. We need to get with you. At the moment, it's horrible. I'm waiting for a chance. I've got to be so deft. Please don't tell my staff you're talking to me. True. So, and a lot of them, you know who they are, because in the past they have sponsored climate legislation. In fact, for the 3 years that I was in the Senate before Citizens United, there were probably 4 or 5 Republican-sponsored climate change bills floating around at any given time. January 2010 and Citizens United put an end to that publicly, but you can't take somebody like John McCain and tell him what to think. You may be able to silence him for a while, but you cannot tell the man what to think, and there are many, many others like him. Last piece of the good news, the budget that the president is putting out is nonsense. Nobody really cares. Do not be dissuaded or dismayed by the cuts to EPA, the elimination of Sea Grant, and other such efforts. It is an act of political theater. It is not truly an act of budgeting. Unfortunately, this budget process in the Senate and the House has also devolved into an act of political theater and not of true budgeting. In the old days, you passed your appropriations with a majority vote, and the penalty, if you broke the budget guidelines, was you had to get 60 votes. Now, because of the way the Senate behaves, you have to get 60 votes on anything of any importance. So that moots any penalty, and it makes the budget process ridiculous. Where the rubber is going to meet the road on the money is going to be in the appropriations process. And we have Jack Reed in the room who has watched the back of the environmental agencies consistently at his time on that committee. We have a record of recent appropriations, bipartisan appropriations, passed out of the Appropriations Committee as recently as last fall, that are ready to go, that do not contain the sort of theatrical cuts that the administration has proposed. And in the event that they don't follow regular order and work through those appropriations, their alternative is to create a deadlock when the government is going to stop being funded if we don't reach a deal, when the credit of the United States is going to collapse because of the debt ceiling if we don't reach a deal. And in those circumstances, I think my side of the aisle believes very strongly that we have the upper hand to hold them to reasonable and sensible budgeting. It's very hard to blame Democrats for shutting down the government when all we're asking is that they appropriate at levels that Republicans agreed to just months ago. And we won't be the ones pushing smelly riders into the bill. Trying to jam something in to build the wall is not going to be a Democrat project. Trying to jam something in to defund Planned Parenthood is not going to be a Democratic project. So they're going to be in a predicament if they try to force that issue and shut down the government and cause us to cave to get these really steep budget cuts too. I'm here to tell you that is just not going to happen. So you need to be active in support of the programs that you support. You need to be active in support of those programs, but do not give up hope. Just know that this is a time to be heard. And so let's switch from the good news part of the story to the bad news part of the story. Citizens United is still the law of the land. And the fossil fuel industry, which requested, predicted, and moved instantly in response to that decision, has really crushed Republican opposition. They don't really come after us very much. I can recall giving an unkind speech about the Koch brothers on the Senate floor and being approached in a head of steam by a Republican colleague saying, "Sheldon, what the hell are you complaining about? They're spending more money against us than they're spending against you." And at the time, that was true. They wanted to crush out of the Republican Party any hint of climate compliance, and people like Bob Inglis in the House of Representatives, with a 100% conservative voting record, paid the price. Indeed, as Bob says, it became a verb to be Englist, as they spread around the gospel that if you want to be like him, keep talking about climate change. Otherwise, come on over and shut up for a while. So that's been our predicament. Where we can make a big difference, we can't help with them. And don't believe ExxonMobil that they support a carbon fee. That's utter nonsense. The CEO may say that, but I live in the battle. And every single cannon in their entire political gun deck is deployed against doing anything resembling a carbon fee. That is a complete phony statement. But on the other side, 170 big American corporations have signed up to support the Strong Paris Agreement. Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Walmart, Target, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Coke, Pepsi, and others. Big name brands, Cargill, Unilever, Kellogg's, General Mills, you can go on and on and on. So there are really good corporate friends out there. Here's their dirty secret. They don't show up on this issue in Congress at all. Coke and Pepsi are probably two of our best companies on climate change within their corporate fences, and they're pretty good on it in terms of pushing out the supply chain as well. Pepsi supports a group called Ceres in Boston, which does good work trying to organize corporate support for climate change action. So you got to give them a little bit of credit for that. But their real lobbying is done through the American Beverage Association, which has never lifted a finger on climate. When we looked at funding Obamacare with a tax on sugary beverages that contribute to obesity and diabetes and so forth, then you saw them.
Yeah, right.
But on this, not a peep. Worse, Coke and Pepsi run money through the American Beverage Association to the United States Chamber of Commerce, which is my most inveterate, powerful, and implacable enemy on getting anything done about climate change. So if you set aside all Coke and Pepsi's policies and you just look at their presence in Congress, you give them an ounce of credit in the balance for Pepsi's participation in Ceres. You give them 0 for their actual lobbying work through the American Beverage Association, and a ton against them from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Their net lobbying presence in Washington is powerfully hostile to their own stated position. Similarly, I had meetings in 1 week a year ago from TechNet, which is the lobbying group for Silicon Valley, which includes a great number of green energy companies, from the lumber and timber industry, right? Who knew about the beetles in the west, or the deciduous forests working their way northwards in the east? Or the property casualty insurance industry. That was the third, in the same week. They're the ones who write the checks when the weather goes haywire. You add up all the materials that they presented in their presentation and the handouts, and you look to summarize and add the number of mentions of climate change, and the sum total was 0. So we have a big opportunity as an environmental community to push these companies to do something that shouldn't be too hard, to align their advocacy with their policy. That, I think, gives us an enormous opportunity. And when you think about all of those Republican senators who are waiting for cover, it's not a vain exercise. They just need to know that they're not going to be hanging on the barbed wire of Citizens United, shot to political pieces by the Koch brothers. They need to know that there is some safe passage through the political kill zone that has been established for Republican politicians by this enterprise. So, and then I think they're ready to go. And I have a bill that matches very closely the carbon price that the 3 Republican Treasury Secretaries have recommended. So it's not as if we're asking them to take a run at the fence and jump over to the other side, and then we're going to have a big fight. We actually agree on the getaway car, and we're prepared to negotiate. So there remains some room. We are going to have to push back. I mean, the simple fact of the matter is that the government of the United States under this administration has now been occupied by the fossil fuel industry. Whether it's Scott Pruitt, their little functionary from Oklahoma, or Rex Tillerson, the former head of ExxonMobil at the State Department, or all of the raft of climate deniers who crawl through the Oval Office and through these agencies in the non-confirmed positions. This is a really, really bizarre group of people. And they have really bizarre views about climate change, but they're just determined. They're there on a mission. And it's really going to be important for the environmental community to stand up and push back, and particularly to support folks who are in there suing. The Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act both have citizen suit provisions. They also share another commonality. The United States Supreme Court has set the terms for enforcement on carbon and enforcement on clean waters. It is solid United States Supreme Court law. So once carbon has been determined to be a pollutant, Massachusetts versus EPA, they got to regulate. And if they don't, lawyers can come in under the citizen suit provisions and force their hand. So we are not doomed to being neutered and having no capability during this administration. We're just going to have to grab them and take them to court. And that, I'm afraid, is going to be slow and tedious and expensive. But it's an honest place where people have to tell the truth. Perjury is taken seriously in court. Where people get cross-examined. You can't just fire your thing on Fox News and then run and hide. Where you can do discovery into the funding and the background and the basis for recusal of people. And it's a wonderful opportunity, I think, to help clear this up. So I guess the last thing I'll say is, what's the to-do list? Organize. My wonderful colleague, Barbara Mikulski, yet another community organizer who rose to high office and the first woman elected in her own right to the United States Senate. She used to point out to us, guys, none of you had to die for me to come here. I hope you appreciate that. She used to say, don't agonize, organize. And there are lots of groups to organize through right now. My message is not to pick one in particular, but to follow your passion and make sure your voice is heard. Don't forget April 29th, the climate march. If you can't get to Washington, get to someplace. Make sure that you're on the street on April 29th for the climate march. It makes a difference for people to come together. It was incredibly inspiring to be at the Women's March in Washington, and it didn't hurt that we blew out the crowd that had been there for the inauguration. And last but not least, don't forget the oceans. We are, after all, the ocean state. At the Naval Station Newport tide gauge, we're up 10 inches in sea level rise since the 1930s. If you weren't around then, and very few of us were, go take a look at the Google photographs of the hurricane of 1938 and what that did to Rhode Island. And imagine how much development has happened since then. And remember that that 10 inches of extra sea level actually gets increased by the storm surge. You don't take the surge of the 38 hurricane or of Sandy and add 10 inches to it. We don't know exactly what those measures are, but it's definitely more than a bathtub 10 inches, because that 10 inches goes all the way out to sea, and when it gets pushed in, it's much more here. Look at the photographs of the hurricanes of 38 and 54 and what they did to our state. And we've got some coming attractions that we have to worry about. We have, and it's an easy measurement. You know, it's basically a yardstick. 93% of the excess heat from climate change has gone into the oceans. That's why they're warming. We're worried about 2 degrees increase in temperature. If the oceans weren't there sucking up all that extra heat, 93% of it, we'd be looking at 30 degrees increase in temperature. And our planet would have changed really beyond recognition. And we'd be fighting for survival instead of enjoying the benefits of civilization. So thank and remember the oceans. And then, of course, in addition to the heat going into the oceans, about a third of the CO2 goes in just by process of chemical reaction. I did a demonstration on the floor of the Senate the other day where I blew some bubbles into my glass through an aquarium bowl, and I put in pH dyes so you could see the actual pH of the ocean change as I blew carbon dioxide through the water. It's fresh water, not ocean, but it's a similar principle. Add CO2 and chemistry happens and the ocean becomes more acidic. It's becoming more acidic at the fastest rate in 50 million years, which is somewhat significant when you think that humans have been around for about 200,000 years. And we're already starting to see shellfish farms in the Northwest where the deep water brings in harder pulses of acidified water, wiped out by acidification. The little larval oysters just dissolve in their seawater. Studies off the Northwest show that the pteropod, a really beautiful little snail with its little foot, is metamorphosed into an ocean wing, and it's a really base species in the food chain out there. 50% of the pteropods sampled by NOAA and an international group of scientists had severe shell damage. If that species falls out, and the northern Pacific is the cafeteria for most of the creatures of the ocean up there, then we've got big, big problems. So pH testing is pretty hard to deny. Thermometers are pretty hard to deny. And basically a glorified yardstick is pretty hard to deny. So both because the oceans are probably going to be the place where our species gets the first and biggest hit from climate change, I mean the real punch, and because they really can't work their denial game there very well, don't forget the oceans. So thank you all for what you're doing. I look forward to continuing to work with you. You all make me proud every day. I know you've got my back, and I also know that you're working so hard to continue to make this beautiful state of ours a continued gem and to protect it from the pressures that are mounting against it in the environment. So bless you all, and thank you very, very much.